everybody, and welcome to our fourth session in this symposium on examining Islamic movements in politics and governance. And this is our third symposium in this regards, which covers the Ennahda movement in Tunisia. This particular session is going to be in English, and we have four distinguished guests with us. The title of the session is Examining Ennahda's Experience, Different Perspectives on Ennahda in Politics and Governance. As I said, we have four distinguished speakers. Each speaker at the beginning is going to speak for about 10 minutes, opening statements, and then we will engage them in a discussion. And with me today is my co-host, Awais Khan. Awais is a research fellow here at the center. He's about to finish his PhD in political ideology regarding the issue of sovereignty from Syracuse University. Our speakers are in the order that they would appear. First, we have Intisar Khregi. Intisar is an associate researcher at the Center for International Relations at Sciences Po Paris. She received her PhD in political science at Sciences Po Paris in 2021. Her academic research focuses on decentralization, regional inequalities, and local governance reforms in post-revolution Tunisia. She holds a bachelor in law from Cambridge University and master's in human rights from the London School of Economics. She is a qualified lawyer and previously worked as lawyer and legal advisor at several law firms and human rights organizations. She's previously also worked as a researcher in the UK House of Lords, the United Nations Security Council in New York, and the European Parliament in Brussels. In 2013, she founded or co-founded Jasmine Foundation, a think and do tank in Tunisia that focuses on youth empowerment and citizen participation in decision making. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Tahir Kelavuz. Tahir is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Marmara University here in Turkey. His research interests include authoritarian regimes, regime change, religion and politics, coups and surveys, both in the Middle East and between regions. His work focuses on the continuity of authoritarian regimes, the transformation of regimes into democracies and other authoritarian regimes, and the effects of political institutions on the behavior of both regimes and citizens in these processes. He received his doctoral in political science from the University of Notre Dame and his master's from Koç University in Turkey. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Middle East Initiative Program at Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Our third speaker is Monica Marks. Monica is a scholar of Islamic or Islamist movements, gender and politics in the Middle East and North Africa. Her research focuses on broad topics across the region and beyond, but especially with regard to the tensions between pluralism and state power in the two countries where she's lived longest, Tunisia and Turkey. Prior to joining the New York University, because she's now an assistant professor at New York University in Abu Dhabi, Dr. Marks was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard, and she completed also her PhD, an ethnographic study of post-2011 Tunisian politics based on over 1,200 interviews in the country. And this was in 2018 rather, at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. She was also a Rhodes Scholar. Our final speaker for today is Dr. William Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence is, I'm sorry, I have I have two biographies, so I'm going to choose one. Dr. Lawrence has 3 decades experience working on Tunisia. He lived and worked immersively for 12 years in North Africa and Tunisia as a student of Arabic, Fulbright scholar, researcher, and diplomat. He is a professor of political science and international affairs at American University, as well as senior advisor for North Africa at C&O Resources, which is non-resident Tunisia expert at the Middle East Institute. He's a board member and past president of the American Tunisia Groups and Control Risks North Africa Director, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy Programs Director, and Tunisia Analyst at Freedom House. Previously, he served at the State Department's Middle East Partnership Initiative North Africa team, where he led it and spent 4.5 years in charge of the US-Tunisia Science, Technology, and Environment, Health and Environment programs. Prior to that, he was State Department officer in charge of Tunisian affairs. He taught at several universities, including Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, George Washington, and Tufts University, as well as lectured at over 100 universities worldwide. Dr. Lawrence testified on Tunisia many times before the U.S. Senate Relations Committee and the House of Representatives, and he is the co-author of After the Uprisings, Political Transition in Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, and has published widely in many journals and magazines. Welcome to the four of you. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really a pleasure. I would give the floor first to Intisar. Dr. Regi, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be speaking more about the developmental aspects, I think, of the transition and of Nahda's role. I know that there was a session on this yesterday, but I think it's important because much of the crisis that we are seeing at the moment is, I think, due to economic issues. And I think that the economy has to be at the heart of analyzing and evaluating the Tunisian experience. So I think that it's important to look at what has gone wrong, what has gone well in terms of development, and what should be done differently, and what lessons can be drawn. Because Tunisia is of course, has its specific context, but at the same time, it has a lot of similarities with the rest of the region in terms of the economic challenges that the country faces. And particularly the model of what has been called patrimonial capitalism, which is very much based on patronage-based economic systems. And so I think that it's important first to analyze or underline one point, which is that the Tunisian state has actually been revealed to be weaker in developmental terms than we had thought. So the Tunisian state is considered to be one of the strongest in terms of the public administration in the Arab world. But I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is that its capacity has been very limited. And so we have to look here at how those political actors, including Ennahda, were governing the state. But we also have to unpack a bit what kind of transformations internally that state institutions have been undergoing. And so I think we cannot really look at the role of Ennahda without looking at the state itself, the Tunisian state. And my research, particularly on local politics and local government, really looked at how the state has changed in the last 10 years. And one of the biggest changes is that power has been fragmented across different actors. And so we went from a situation before 2011 where there was a very centralized rule, where you had much of the power and resources in the hands of a dominant center of power, and where the ruling party, the RCD, the ruling party exercised a very central role. It was effectively, as Camus calls it, Michel Camus, the gravity of the state. The center of gravity of the state, excuse me. So this ruling party, which would previously exercise significant functions in terms of coordinating the actions of the state, policies, and coercing citizens to also respect the decisions of the state, was suddenly removed in 2011. And so I think in order for us to understand and analyze and evaluate Ennahda's role, we have to also look more widely at how the state that Ennahda and its coalition partners were placed in charge of, how that state was also transforming and also fragmenting. And so what we saw in 2011 was a kind of dispersal of power across many different actors. And so when we are talking about a political party or a government, they are, of course, not the only actors working in a vacuum. But what we have is actually, since 2011, the dispersal of power across many different actors within the state and outside the state. And so we are talking about the bureaucracy, for example, the public administration and its role. We're talking about the security forces. We're talking about economic elites. We are talking about trade unions, business organizations, civil society. And actually, in the transition, whoever was in government faced the very difficult challenge of exerting control over many of these different actors in a situation of a kind of, fragmentation of power across different spheres. And so I think that it's important to start with this in order just to understand that before we talk about evaluating the government or the Ennahda or any political party, understanding what task that it had before it after 2011. The question is, I think, that is relevant to countries across the region is how do you move from a situation where power is highly centralized in the hands of a very small elite and where the respect for the law and for the state was enforced largely through coercion and through force. How do you move from that to a situation where you have power sharing between different institutions, where you have independent institutions, such as an independent judiciary, and where you have a rule of law that is respected by citizens without the need for repression? And I think this transition in Tunisia was further complicated by the fact that those who were pro-reform, the pro-reform actors were themselves internally fragmented. And so Ennahda, of course, was in coalition with other parties, coalitions which were fragmented, which were divided by ideological divisions, and by an electoral law also that dispersed power very widely. And so I want to speak very briefly about particularly the economic decisions that were made during this period. And so it's clear that already in 2011, Tunisia was suffering an economic crisis. The economic crisis had already started, and that's one of the main factors that actually started the revolution was the economic crisis that was underway. And you had a system of government that was based on patronage, that was based on monopolies. And so, the question was how to reform this economic model and how to actually grow the economy in a way that was inclusive, particularly of regions which had been marginalized. Of course, the interior regions, such as Sidi Bouzid, where the revolution started, but also many other interior regions. And I think it's important to recognize that there were successes and failures. And I think that the failures were not for lack of trying. I think that it's important to look at some of the innovative policies and ideas that were introduced in the last 10 years. So, for example, in the constitution, there were many innovative policies such as positive discrimination in favor of marginalized regions, which had before the revolution been excluded from development, excluded from much of public finance and investment, etc. And so there were many interesting innovative ideas that were put forward, such as giving extra resources and advantages to these regions. Also, the notion of decentralization. And here I actually did my PhD thesis on decentralization. And the party that was most in favor of decentralization was Ennahda, along with actually the remnants of the CPR and also Al-Jabha Al-Sha'biya, the far left coalition. So those parties that were associated with opposition to Ben Ali were very pro-decentralization. And decentralization was largely designed to actually deepen democracy and also to bring development, economic development to these regions which had been forgotten and left behind and discriminated against. But we also saw after 2011, there were efforts to bring in transparency in terms of, for example, the access to information law, which was passed in 2016 or 17, which was the furthest reaching in the Arab world. Also, in 2011 to 14, the budget that was dedicated to regional development of interior regions was quadrupled. And there were also various economic reforms, such as the investment code, trying to help small businesses, trying to help entrepreneurs. However, these had limited effects. And the reason was, partly one, the implementation was ineffective. So they met with a lot of resistance So, for example, the access to information law was resisted, obviously, by many working within the public administration, for example, who did not want to share information. There was resistance from the dominant economic elites, who did not want to see the public authorization system of authorizations for all economic activity changed, and who stood to lose from these reforms. And so we can say that a lot of reforms were made, but actually the strategies for implementing them were not effective. And those who were trying to reform the system were not able to overcome actually the resistance and the counter strategies of those resisting the reform. And so I think it's important to also analyze that Tunisia is not the only democracy facing these challenges. One of the debates today in Tunisia is democracy able to deliver development and able to deliver good governance? Of course, this is a very big debate. We can see other countries, look at Indonesia, look at South Africa, look at the US itself. If you look at, some of the oldest democracies in the world, the UK, where you continue to have corruption. And I think that we have to relativize also our evaluation and say, this has been 10 years in which there were some successes, some failures. But also Tunisia's challenges are not unique, and many other democracies are facing these challenges. To conclude, were Tunisians to have the chance to do things differently, and hopefully there will be a chance to reform the system rather than destroy it in the coming years, I would focus on a number of things that I think really hindered the transition. One of these is the election law. Many of people have spoken about the election law, which in the beginning worked quite well during the drafting of the constitution in order to make sure that there was inclusion of a multitude of voices and pluralistic voices. But ultimately, it led to fragmented governments that were not able to have a coherent strategy on the economy, that were not able to work together, and that were often very divided. And so elections, I think, electoral formula that actually produces coherent coalitions is absolutely needed in the future. Also, of course, having a pro-reform coalition that is able to overcome its internal divisions is very important. Of course, we know that's very difficult in the Arab world, where there is a lot of ideological polarization. But ultimately, the pro-reform coalition was weaker than the anti-reform coalition. And so there has to be serious thought given to how to actually strengthen pro-reform actors and allow them to come together around some shared common ground in order to reform their systems. Also, a third point, I think, that was absolutely overlooked and not given enough attention is public administration reform. In the first few years after the revolution, at the time of the Troika, there were some attempts in the beginning to talk about reform in the administration, removing corruption, but ultimately this created a very tense and a hostile relationship between those in government and the public administration, who ultimately are the ones who will be implementing the decisions of those in power. And so this tension between working with the public administration and reforming it has never been resolved, I think, during the transition. And this is a factor that absolutely has to be addressed by any party, any actor who wants to actually introduce real reforms and changes. Ultimately, lastly, I'll jump because I know that there isn't much time. I think public communication is absolutely critical. I know that there was a session on media, and I think it's very important to consider how in times of difficult reforms, because the Tunisian state has to go through difficult reforms, all Arab states have to go through difficult reforms in order to really achieve more inclusive economies, such as, for example, subsidies reform. More thought has to be given to actually how to engage the public and how to inform the public and how to communicate with the public in order to actually explain these changes, and in order to also overcome the propaganda and the resistance that will inevitably come from powerful vested interests. And so it's naive to expect that those whose interests are going to be touched and affected and targeted will not be able to mount a counter campaign. So I think public communication is very important. And that really requires also political parties who are able to effectively communicate with the public and also to effectively design public policies. So I think that this, this applies not only to Ennahda, of course, but also to all parties in Tunisia and across the Arab world, where I think that many factors, including lack of governance experience, have meant that political parties don't have the structures or the experience to really design effective policies and also communicate with them, with the public about them. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Craigie, for your remarks. Next, we have Professor Klavos. Professor Tarek Klavos, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks a lot for organizing this panel, and greetings to all fellow panelists and the listeners. So obviously, Ennahda's experience during this time is many different things. So I think it is better to focus on specific aspects of Ennahda's experience. So I decided to focus more on Ennahda's experience with other actors in Tunisia, mainly its relations with the so-called seculars or the non-Islamists in Tunisia. And this topic is actually kind of important because when discussing the success of democratic transition in Tunisia, many people emphasize the experience of cooperation between Ennahda and other actors, especially between 2011 and 2013-14, which I agree to some extent. It was very important for the completion of democratic transition back then. It was not only Ennahda's doing, obviously, the other side of the cooperation definitely deserved praise, as well as Ennahda. But in general, when we look at this last decade, Ennahda's cooperative attitude or consensus-seeking attitude had some positive and negative aspects at the same time. So Ennahda benefited from these experiences and as well as suffered from some of the consensus-making processes. And as Ennahda being the biggest party in Tunisia, the Tunisian experience in general both benefited and suffered from these experiences to some extent. So this is why I think it is helpful to go over some of these experiences and summarize these. So Ennahda's close relations or cooperative relations with other actors actually can be found before 2011 as well. I mean, the earlier experiences can even go back to 1980s with the National Pact, but mainly we see more cooperation from Ennahda, especially during the 2000s. And this is not uncommon for Islamist parties in general. We see similar experiences in Jordan, Morocco, Syria, Egypt with different degrees, but the Tunisian experience was actually even more successful than the others. So in 2000s, probably one of the biggest attempts at one of the earliest attempts of cooperation was a conference that was organized in Aix-en-Provence in France in 2003 between Ennahda and several non-Islamist parties and civil society organizations. And that kind of started the relations between these two actors. That was the first step for what was to come after that. And probably the biggest step was the experience of the October 18 collective, which started with a hunger strike in 2005, but then later turned into an opposition coalition, which actually played a very important role in setting the good relations between the main actors of the transition, as well as defining some of the shared vision of these actors in the next couple of years. So obviously these experiences turned into like more positive outcomes during the transition process between 2011 and 13 or 14, wherever we finished the transition process. So, I mean, probably you know most of the details, so I'm not going to go into details, but starting from Troika, we see that Ennahda's cooperation with non-Islamist parties and civil society organizations actually helped this process. Obviously, there were many ups and downs, but during this process, trying to find solutions through dialogue, through cooperation actually helped a lot. Obviously, after the first year or first couple of months of Troika, we started to see more crises, and especially in late 2012 and 2013, there was a downtime. But again, the dialogue and cooperative attitudes kind of saved the process. We usually focus on the national dialogue in Tunisia, but actually the dialogue initiatives had started even before national dialogue. There was an initiative from the President Marzouki, and then there was Dar Diyafa dialogue, which played an important role in the completion of the constitution writing. And then there was the consensus committee that was founded in the parliament that pretty much finalized the constitutional writing process. So these were important steps. And most of these steps were still mainly between the ex-opposition actors of Tunisia. So the opposition turned into pro-reform or pro-democratic forces in Tunisia. Then, especially with the national dialogue, we started to see that cooperation, the actors in the cooperation started to change a bit as well. Obviously, most of these actors participated in national dialogue as well, but with this process, we saw that the cooperation with the old regime actors, as well as business and bureaucratic elites, became a part of the cooperation or dialogue as well. So Ennahda started to have more dialogue or cooperation or trying to find resolutions with these actors. And at the end, the second elections took place. The constitution was ratified, and Tunisia completed its transition then. But especially after 2014, the experience of cooperation or consensus making had started to have some somewhat different effects. So consensus during a transition process and consensus making during post-transition are actually different things. Usually, when you look at transition experiences in different regions as well, cooperation, consensus, unity governments, these are quite helpful for completing a democratic transition. But once the first step is done, the democratic transition is done, once a country is moving into consolidation process, which takes time, consensus is not always that helpful, and it's not always that needed. Like when we look at like other regions, actually, we see that the differentiation can actually help during the process of consolidation. In Latin America, the scholars emphasize even a good level of polarization and differentiation between different parties, their party brands, the battles between them in the parliament, etc., rather than consensus making and unity governments during the process after transition. And we kind of saw the somewhat negative effects of consensus making in Tunisia, especially after 2014. So there are good reasons for Ennahda to seek consensus making during this process as well. And this is pretty much Ennahda-like as well. I mean, Sheikh Ghannouchi always emphasizes consensus, unity, majoritarianism for democracy. So these are what we expect from Ennahda. And at the same time, with what happened in 2013, with the Egyptian experience and all, Ennahda focused a bit more on its survival as well, which is understandable considering the experiences of Islamist parties under authoritarianism. So this is why probably Ennahda emphasized consensus making, unity governments with NIDA, and then cooperation with Qalb later in last couple of years. I think that played a role in that as well. But actually, this kind of had some negative effects on Ennahda and the Tunisian experience as well. First, for Ennahda, rather than moving into opposition, Ennahda became a part of the government. And the party was not necessarily in power. It didn't control the authority, but it was part of the government. So without having the power, they were actually became the target of blame as well. And the mistakes of the government and the mishaps also was blamed on Ennahda, along with NIDA and other parties as well. So being in opposition at that time actually could help to Ennahda and to Tunisia as well to push for more reform, more change, etc., etc. On the other hand, as I said, there might be some detrimental effects of consensus making on the democratic consolidation in Tunisia. Some call it the dark side of consensus politics, especially after 2014. The attempts of national unity governments, increasing disagreements between these major parties to form governments, these all created multiple problems. So Tunisia ended up with unstable governments, problems like the political deadlocks, taking wrong actions or bad actions on the economic field, failing of forming a constitutional court, finding solutions to controversial issues, etc., etc. So these all led to instability and the lack of institutional routinization. Without a strong government and with the unity governments that are fragmented and not so strong, bold reforms could not be taken, especially on the issues such as security sector reform, anti-corruption, economy, transitional justice, etc., etc. So, like in the long run, like in the short run, maybe consensus politics helped for Ennahda in 2014, and at that point, maybe it looked like a right decision for the decision makers. But in the long run, that created some other problems as well and prevented the potential consolidation of the Tunisian democracy. So when we look at today, the post-July 25 period, I'm sure Monica will talk about this more and she knows more about this for sure. But we see that Ennahda is trying to pursue cooperation with other actors again. But unlike the last couple of years, this is probably the good strategy again, because we are back again to a process of potential transition. So during this process, the hunger strike was probably a good initiative, and Ennahda is trying to work with other actors and not necessarily putting itself to forefront. But despite these efforts, there are still a fragmented opposition and probably a more stronger front against the Said regime will be needed. So to conclude, looking at the Ennahda's experience with others, we can make three conclusions maybe. One is, in general, this is very well known, that Ennahda is a party that is open to dialogue. The second is Ennahda is a pragmatic and flexible party, which is not necessarily bad. This is a good thing that can adjust to different conditions. And also Ennahda prioritizes survival, just like many other Islamist parties, but this was seen more after 2014. So these characteristics of Ennahda are actually quite helpful sometimes to help resolving problems, but at the same time, sometimes it has negative effects in terms of postponing or problems, or maybe exacerbating some of the issues, and it can eventually lead to the disillusionment of the public, both from the party and also from the experience as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kilavuz. Our third speaker is Monica Marks. Monica, I've already been introduced, and after your initial remarks, we're going to engage in a discussion. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I apologize for the delay. but it was wonderful to listen to Intisar and Tahir's presentations before me. I want to start by bringing everyone back to a certain moment that I've often thought about a great deal in Tunisia's transition over the past decade. And that moment is in January of 2012, when the first democratically appointed Minister of Interior walks in to take his post. And that man is Ali Al-Rayed, a very important member of Ennahda, who himself was tortured in the basement of that same ministry for about 16 years. Not the entire time wasn't in that location, but he spent over a decade in solitary confinement, tortured in the basement of that ministry, this large gray slab of a building that stands on Avenue Habib Bourguiba. It was an important moment because it combined both the emotional soaring hopes of someone who had been such a victim of the old regime, now seemingly taking the reins of the very most rotten, corrupted, corroded of all of the ministries or sectors of power under the old dictatorship. But it also paired that sense of hope with a real sense of doubt about to what extent could this newly elected first post-revolutionary government, of which Ennahda headed a three-party coalition, the Troika coalition, to what extent could it really take power? To what extent could it have a usable bureaucracy in Tunisia? Because this same man who had been tortured in the basement of that ministry, the folks who worked in that ministry had been taught to look at him basically as a subhuman rat because he was a member of Ennahda. My mind often goes back to that moment, to that experience, because since July 25th, a lot of the conversation about whether or not Kais Saied's actions constituted a coup, about whether or not they were justified, center on the failures of Tunisia's past 10 years of post-revolutionary governments, almost all of which included in some capacity Ennahda, to spearhead desperately needed reforms in Tunisia. Chief among those was, of course, economic reform, delivering tangible benefits of the revolution beyond just freedom of speech, things that affected people's pocketbooks, but also security sector reform, dealing with the longstanding problem of police brutality in Tunisia, for example, due process, etc. And a lot of folks who look at July 25th and say, yes, indeed, that moment was justified. Saied's intervention was really a course correction, or at least the hope of one, that was desperately needed and desperately justified. A lot of those folks point the finger of blame principally at Ennahda. So understanding Ennahda's role over the past 10 years in as detailed a fashion as possible is absolutely critical for making sense of the entire democratic experiment in Tunisia and for making sense of the de-democratization that we're seeing continue apace as Kais Saied consolidates his dictatorship in the country, which we saw happen very aggressively this week with his dissolution of the High Judicial Council, the last safeguard of judicial independence. My own PhD dissertation was an internal ethnography of the politics inside Ennahda after the revolution of 2011. And I found a lot of very interesting things in the course of doing, over 1,200 interviews went into that, not just with Ennahda, of course, but with all different political players to have a better contextual understanding. One of the most important findings of that research was that there was a kind of paradox of victimization surrounding Ennahda's ability to spearhead important reforms in post-revolutionary Tunisia. What do I mean by that paradox of victimization? I mean that in 2011, had you voted for Ennahda, you might have looked at Ennahda as the party that was most aggressed by the Bourguiba and Ben Ali regimes. And you would have been correct. Ennahda didn't have a monopoly on victimization. Of course, a lot of leftists were oppressed too, etc. but certainly Ennahda's members and their families were more victimized than any other group in Tunisian society. Large numbers, by the thousands, were tortured, forced into political exile, etc. So it would have been logical to think in 2011, when you voted for Ennahda, that they were going to be the party of change. However, their hands were largely tied in power. They were unable to ever be the tip of the revolutionary reformist spear for a handful of reasons. One of those reasons was trauma, honestly. A lot of people in this party, in this movement, have experienced real trauma. We're talking almost unspeakable forms of torture and social marginalization, being banned from employment, being aggressed simply because you wear the headscarf in ways that, honestly, my friends in Turkey, my friends in AK Party in Turkey can't even imagine. The experience of Ennahda doesn't even compare. It was so much worse. A second reason is pathologization externally. So, Tunisia has a decades-long history of dictators viewing Ennahda as the biggest political threat to their power, but diabolizing it as basically an extremist fanatic terrorist group. Now, the entire history of Ennahda, I think, stands in contradiction to that diabolization. Tahir touched on this briefly, but Ennahda has a strong history of cross-ideological cooperation with other anti-Bourguiba, Ben Ali, Kais Saied, anti-dictatorial parties. I often talk about 1981, when Ennahda held its first press conference. This was when it went by a different name, very early in its history. And it announced very openly at that event that it was happy to work with communists. Now, that announcement raised a lot of ire and surprise amongst Ikhwani-oriented cousin-like movements, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere in the region, who said, how can you be Islamist? How can you be Ikhwani if you are willing to work with communists? But Ennahda was very clear from the outset that they were happy to work with anyone in opposition to Bourguiba. They have a strong history also of internal modes of organization that are more pluralistic, more democratic than almost any other political party in Tunisia. Now, this has shifted over the past few years, I would say since 2016, as internal debates in Ennahda about the level of pluralism and about Rashid Ghannouchi's role get more heated. But the fact remains that if you look at the breadth of Tunisian history, Ennahda has stronger internal pluralism than other parties. Ennahda also has a history of democracy-conducive political theology. It's very, very different from other so-called Islamist or Ikhwani-oriented parties in the region, most notably the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, in its political theology. So from its founding, Ennahda was inspired not only by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but by figures like the Algerian intellectual Malik Benabi, the Zaytuna school of Sharia-based reasoning, looking at maqasid, masalih, the higher objectives and interests of legality, rather than just having a very literalist, textualist reading of Sharia. And you saw all these things come out when Ennahda entered the constitutional drafting process. Another important thing to mention is that, back on the point about its pluralist internal organization, Ennahda never had a separate qism or branch for women like the Egyptian Brotherhood did. They always included women from the beginning. This is not to exonerate Ennahda, to say it wasn't hasn't made many mistakes, but it is to just draw attention to how much better prepared Ennahda was, or should logically have been, to lead or have an active role in a democratic transition than other so-called Islamist parties in the region. We can contrast Ennahda with the AKP in Turkey, for example, where no leader of the AKP has ever won election with less than 95% of the vote. Very, very different, more dynamically contested, more pluralistic situation inside Ennahda, which helped the party a lot. It also helped the party make concessions internally and defend those concessions and keep a lot of its supporters on board in the early years of Tunisia's transition. However, the fact remains that there was this paradox of victimization. The internal traumatization and the external pathologization of the party made it very difficult for Ennahda to be the pointed tip of the reformist revolutionary spear. I go back to that illustration of Ali al-Rayed as Minister of the Interior. He found himself administering a building in which the vast majority of people had been taught to think of him as scum. And there was a great deal of pushback. It started organizing itself into police unions, for example, in 2013. Ennahda faced similar problems across a lot of different realms. These problems only got more pronounced as the political assassinations in 2013 of Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi happened, which, because Belaid was a main critic of Ennahda, a lot of people wanted to pin the blame on Ennahda. Now, we don't have any clear evidence that pins the blame, but we still see conspiratorial thinking about Ennahda perhaps orchestrating those assassinations being a key part of Kais Saied's new regime now, how he legitimizes his power. We only saw these problems get more and more pronounced as Nida Tunis was formed, the anti-Ennahda party that had a lot of old regime players in its leadership structure. It won Tunisia's second free and fair elections in 2014, and when it came to power in 2015, Ennahda was faced with a very difficult choice. Ennahda could try to go along to get along, or perhaps be completely marginalized from power. Does it want one teensy tiny kind of inconsequential seat at the table, or does it want to be completely marginalized from power? And I think getting back to the trauma of exile, the trauma of exclusion, it didn't want to be completely marginalized. It wanted to cling to that seat at the table. Now, the price for that was to get on board with a number of things that Nida Tunis wanted to do that its supporters might not have wanted to do. Most notably, the Economic Reconciliation Act that finally passed in 2017. This was an act that let off the hook a lot of it amnestied corrupted former businessmen from the Ben Ali era. Now, this was wildly unpopular with Ennahda's supporters, but Ennahda, even though it didn't initiate the law, it ended up being an enabler, facilitating the law, because it saw the alternative as dramatic political exclusion. Now, that's not to engage in any kind of apologia for Ennahda's behavior, but it is to provide context. And context is what's often so sorely lacking when we evaluate Ennahda's behavior over the past 10 years. I just want to make one last statement to kind of get the conversation flowing a little bit more possibly. One of the most interesting findings of my PhD research was that the inclusion moderation hypothesis framework, which we as at least Western or Western-based scholars tend to use disproportionately to analyze Islamist parties and movements. In other words, can they moderate? Can they moderate? And can they integrate politically? Can they normalize? And the idea being that if they moderate on theological, classically Islamist grounds, they're going to have an easier time getting included politically, getting normalized. This framework has guided almost all the research on Islamist parties conducted in the West over the past few decades. One of my central findings from my research was that framework actually wasn't terribly useful. In fact, it led me down completely dark, unproductive alleyways of research. For example, it took me a few years to lose my fixation with Ennahda's approach to Sharia, Ennahda's approach to blasphemy, Ennahda's approach to women's rights. Because I went in with this inclusion moderation-based assumption that Ennahda's recalcitrance maybe on those issues, or maybe, its bases assumed recalcitrance, would pose the biggest hurdles to its ability to constructively contribute to Tunisia's democratic transition. And what I found out actually was that it cleared those hurdles relatively easily. That's not to say there wasn't internal debate about those concessions. There was. But the concessions that were the hardest for Ennahda to make were the ones that had to do with hard power. with cooperating with the old regime, or what its members saw as the old regime. So, for example, when Rashid Ghannouchi defied the party to basically orchestrate a deal with Beji Qaeda Sebsi at a hotel in Paris in 2013, that it was that negotiation, more than anything else, more than the Nobel Peace Prize winning quartet, that brought an end to Tunisia's Bardo crisis of 2013 that almost sunk the transition. That was highly, highly controversial inside Ennahda. Ennahda's refusal to pass lustration legislation a little bit later, in other words, lustration that would have barred then most popular presidential candidate Beji Qaeda Sebsi and others who had worked under the old regimes from running for office. This was hugely controversial. It failed to pass in parliament by just one vote of the Naftawi, who changed their vote of yes to a vote of abstention. It was hugely controversial, much more than Sharia, blasphemy, or women's rights. So, I also think that the assumption that it was going to be Ennahda's recalcitrant Islamism somehow that was going to be its biggest hurdle to clear in terms of integrating and normalizing as a political party was a wrong-headed assumption too. Now, when we look at a lot of the diatribes against Ennahda, one of the clearest lines of attack that we see, in addition to a lot of the old pathologization, which hasn't gone away, regardless of Ennahda's concessions on those classically Islamist issues, is the accusation that Ennahda was somehow too cozy to the RCD, too cozy to the old regime. Ennahda was an anti-reform player. This is a common line of attack now. But it's a line of attack that ignores context. The context of the paradox of victimization that I spoke about. So I think one of the findings there is that the hard power context and this paradox of victimization might pose bigger hurdles, bigger obstacles to so-called Islamist parties. I hate that word. I think it confuses way more than it clarifies. Integration in post-dictatorial contexts than their alleged religious conservatism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marks. Our next participant is Dr. William Lawrence.
Correct. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Thank you, Sami, for inviting me as well, specifically. And I could listen to the other three panelists for another hour. So what a wonderful panel, what a wonderful moment and part of a 3-day event to sort of look at what Nehda's done right and wrong. And I'll get to that in a minute. Let me just say, I think Monica only misspoke on one thing. There's no evidence Nehda was involved in Brahimi's situation, not clear evidence. I think that Monica knows that. So I'm not correcting her. I'm just helping her restate what she said. Let me also say that looking at the whole agenda of the conference, I'm reminded of the old adage, if you send a dentist to Sudan, they'll find that all problems are dental. And what you're going to find over this conference is there are 100 different things Nehda did wrong or didn't do, right, which will be perfectly valid. But as Monica and I agree and have spoken about prior to this conference, they're second order issues. The issue at hand is not only that hard power issue, but the issue of democracy and the issue of reforms in Tunisia, which are far beyond, as Monica got in several of her points, are far beyond anything that Nehda is struggling with internally. And so those first order issues are the problems of now. They are the problems of the last 10 years and prior to the last 10 years, and they will remain the issues. And in that sense, everything of this conference is a second order problem, which it's important to work out, but it's not the problem, right? It's just things that Nehda can do better within a context it did not control. I would also say that Nehda is the most internally democratic and most high-performing of Tunisia's political parties. So, and one of the best Islamic parties in the Arab world as well, and by all the parameters we could judge. So even though we're going to be critical of Nehda, and I will be critical of Nehda in my remarks, and others will be on this panel and elsewhere, you have to put it in the context of Nehda does better than everybody else. So it's not Nehda's failures that are really at issue here. It's more of a question of, you know, even if Nehda was perfect, could it have succeeded in this situation? I would argue, probably not. But with that in mind, we'll delve in here. I first traveled to Tunisia in 1989 as part of my first trek across North Africa. Algeria was in the throes of what it now sometimes refers to as the first Arab Spring, with the creation of over 65 political parties and a free press. Tunisia was beginning to move in the opposite direction, with the putschist Ben Ali running unopposed in presidential elections and beginning his crackdown on Nehda, and eventually all of the Tunisian opposition and nearly all of civil society. There was a joke in the following years about two dogs meeting at the Algerian-Tunisian border. And the Algerian dog crossing in Tunisia was going shopping for everything that he couldn't buy in Tunisia. And the Tunisian dog was crossing into Algeria just to bark. And therein lies the contrast. The Algerian and Tunisian, let's say, experiments and experimentation with Islamist parties and with the economic connections has been one of general failure in the economic regard and relative success when the Islamist parties are allowed to play, but that doesn't matter for the reasons that Monica will get into. Now, Tunisia's crackdown was in full swing by 1991, and Algeria's began in earnest in 1992 and was much more ferocious than Tunisia's. But I'm also bringing this up to remember that the pendulums swing back and forth in both countries and in the other countries around the region, and will swing again. So we have this swinging back and forth towards accommodating Islamists, kicking them out, accommodating, being violent with them, being less violent with them, and that will continue. We're just on one of these swings right now, I would argue, including in Egypt, where it will swing back again. Now, in terms of the lessons learned, the big lesson learned here is use your institutions and protect your institutions. But one of the difficult contexts, which comes up a little bit, Monica and I have talked about it, is this context of Zaimism, right? The political culture of deferring to autocratic leaders. It's why we had Bouteflika for 6 more years after his debilitating heart attack, making him incapable of speaking or governing Algeria. We had it with Bourguiba and Ben Ali. We have it in other autocratic regimes. And we have it right now with Kais Saied. You know, let the old man, you know, the old Zaim is gonna, and I would even argue when Ghannouchi was not sufficiently countered within Nehda, there was some Zaimism there. The fact we even call him Sheikh Ghannouchi, right, is problematic in my mind for a party that calls itself internally democratic, and it is the most internally democratic party, an internally democratic Islamist party in the region. But it's got a certain Zaimism in it, which is problematic. Now, the story of Nehda from the American perspective has been a story primarily of victimization under Bourguiba and Ben Ali, the important role in the democratization movement, and Tahir spoke about it, its role, especially in the 2005 October 18th movement, not just hunger strike, but democracy movement and coalescing of the opposition against the Ben Ali regime, and its struggles and accomplishments of Tunisia's leading political party over the last 11 years, and its current repositioning as a victim of arbitrary autocracy. Despite the confusing statements from the United States in recent months supporting US-Tunisian partnership and the importance of inclusivity in Tunisia, the US government privately has completely lost faith in Kais Saied to reform anything. So have the French and the Europeans. What they're trying to do right now is preserve the relationship with whoever comes after Saied. They're already preparing for the after Saied. And I can give lots of examples during the Q&A about various programs, various relationships. What the US government has not figured out is how they can better support the democratic opposition, which, however, right now is not very organized or powerful yet for reasons Monica recently wrote on in Dawn. And it's going to have to be, because the US doesn't replace regimes the way it used to, with the notable exception of 2003 Iraq, but since the 1970s, it's moving away from that model. It's not, and there have been calls from Tunisian opposition in Washington to help a coup, right? No, it's not going to happen. The U.S. doesn't really do that the way it did exceptionally in 2003 in Iraq or in its further past history. So it's going to take Tunisians to force out Said. And there are many scenarios. Will it be the Saheli elites? Will it be the military? Will it be the opposition? But right now, the U.S. has bigger problems in MENA. It's got conflicts and confrontations in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, the Arab Gulf, Libya, and the Western Sahara, which are more important than Tunisia right now. And globally, it's got Ukraine, it's got North Korea, it's got Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, Uyghurs, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Sahel, Haiti. I could go on for Latin America. The U.S. is not going to expend a lot on Tunisia right now, and I have that from the highest sources. They're just not moving in that direction. However, if things start to coalesce, if the opposition gets together and overcomes the obstacles Monica again wrote on in that Dawn article, the U.S. will come around to support that opposition in certain ways and needs to be pushed to do so. Now, America's view of political Islam is complicated, but it can be loosely divided, whether we're talking about the government or we're talking about academics, into two camps: the accommodationists and the confrontationists. The confrontationists generally see both Islam and political Islam as problematic. They tend to lump everybody together and diabolize often, as Monica talked about. It's the pro-Likud crowd, it's the Trump crowd, it's the authors of the Muslim ban against 6 Muslim-majority countries. It's Campus Watch, which polices what academics say in the classroom in the U.S. Muslims are terrorists, etc. There's an accommodationist camp as well, which produces the theses Monica was talking about, that sees lots of different kinds of Islamists, that accepts Nehda's transition from an Islamist to a Muslim democratic party, that sees the PJD in Morocco and the PJD in Turkey as just fine, in terms of a partner the U.S. government can work with. But we do have, as Hama Hamemi wrote in an interview Monica translated, we do have an Nehda syndrome, right, domestically in Tunisia, which matches up with the political Islamism syndrome in the West, which has to be overcome. How does that get overcome? By communication, by visits. And I was surprised. I took Muslim Brotherhood leaders from Egypt around Washington several years ago. And if you look at the Arab and Muslim press, you often think that the Muslim Brotherhood owns Washington and Washington is in bed with them. And I was going around to these meetings, and this was the first time most of these leaders had been in Washington. No one in the Congress or the executive branch had ever met any of these guys. And to watch the conversations, so this is around 2015, right, was to see the beginning of and the main US question was, before, during, and after these meetings, is how democratic are you? They didn't really care about these second order problems Monica was talking about: blasphemy, women's rights, Sharia, right? Those are the question was, and this is America's Achilles heel itself. Its obsession with, and then problems about, and traumas related to recently about democracy. So the metric is not Islamism, the metric is democracy. And the degree to which the parties seem to be acting democratically, or the Tunisian government seemed to be transitioning back to democracy, is how it'll get bona fides in Washington, not really what it's doing on Islam and Islamist and Muslim issues. Now, I'll conclude with a couple of sort of vague lessons learned, and they track with what the other said, so I won't spend too much time on it. I think Nehda learned the lessons really well of Algeria in the 90s, which looms very large in Nehda's thinking, and its own experience, which tracked but was not as ferocious as Algeria's. And this led to the things that Tahir was referring to as, let's say, survivalism, and Monica was referring to as accommodations, and Intisar talked about them too. And it led to the Carthage Pact, which I say governed Tunisia from 2013 to 2019, and was very much a pacted transition in line with the Latin American political science literature on pacted transitions, where you make these accommodations and you subsume your own interests and goals to what the others in the pact need. But there was a dark side of the pact, as my other panelists said. And I used to call it the "you keep me out of jail and I keep you out of jail" pact, which the economic reconciliation law, which Monica has written on so eloquently, was the best example. It was not the only one. But it was a disastrous piece of legislation. And when I talk to Tunisians now, one of the anti-Nahda crowd, one of the first things they refer to is the corruption of Nahda. And then one of the first things they get into after they talk about fancy cars some Nahda people drive, or maybe some corruption, but they don't have any evidence, it's the fact that they let all those, what Monica said, let all those corrupt businessmen off because they made a deal with the devil. And so not only did Nahda not get economics right, and I can speak at great length on that during the Q&A, but they didn't even get the only economic thing they really did right by signing on to the economic reconciliation law, which they never should have signed on to. Now, the Arab Spring was about the informal economic sector. Nahda never got that right. You had 400 self-immolations after Bouazizi, 90% of which that people who actually killed themselves, 90% of which were informal economic sector actors. I've discussed this with all the leading Tunisian economists and bankers. They still haven't gotten it right. The Bouazizis are still in the street to this day in Tunisia. And until Nahda and everybody else realizes that the economics is not about redistribution. I met with Larayef and the economic team for 3 hours in September of 2011. And it was all about Islamic banking and recutting the regions of Tunisia where the coast would fund the interior. It was never going to work because Tunisia was going to have the J curve. Every country has after a revolution where they're poor for a couple of years before they're rich. So recutting the regions wasn't going to help. Regionalization wasn't going to help itself, right? What was going to help was moving the nearly half of Tunisians who work in the informal economic sector, like Bouazizi, into the formal economy, getting the economy working and making it, to quote another famous Tunisian entrepreneur, a government that doesn't say what you should do, but only what you can't do. And then let the economy run right, which is what the informal sector does. Everybody got that wrong. The Tunisian business class, Nahda, everybody. There were also failures, which others got into. I'll just list them. They were failures in security sector reform, failures in judicial reform, failures even on women's issues. I talked to Nahda women parliamentarians many times. Why aren't you dialoguing with the secular women in the parliament? Well, we tried, we did this. No, there was never a women's coalition that came together. And just the parliament itself. Parliamentarians in Tunisia don't have offices, they don't have staff, they don't have photocopiers or computers. I mean, the parliamentarians themselves were weak. You know, even if the parliament had simply just funded parliamentarians to be proper parliamentarians, the parliament would have worked better. You know, so there were massive failures administratively in all of these sectors and more that I could list, in part because, as Tahar and Monica and Intisar said in different ways, they were busy surviving and not busy reforming. Nahda is not to blame for the presidential coup. It's to blame to some degree for not doing enough when it was a partner in power. And now it's to blame for the last thing I'll say. It's to blame for not reopening parliament. It's very clear under the Tunisian constitution that Article 3 trumps Article 4, that the parliament trumps the president, right? They had one virtual meeting, and because they didn't have a quorum, it didn't lead to much. They should have meeting every single day and saying, not only is this president illegitimate and unconstitutional, right? But we are the main democratic institution of Tunisia, and we're condemning him. We're shutting the presidency down. Like this gets back to Monica's, trauma and everything that everyone said. Until the parliament starts being a parliament and steps up and says, we are the inheritors of the revolution, and we're going to take actions now, instead waiting for 109 people to show up that will vote a certain way, possibly. I mean, it's time for the Tunisian parliament to get up and bark, right? To have virtual meetings daily. The technology is there, and make a statement. And you'll be surprised how much international institutions, international forces will line up. But right now, the opposition is so weak. We're in the mess we're in. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence, and thank you for all our presenters, our panelists, for your opening remarks. Now we have roughly less than an hour, and I'm trying to get into a discussion, engage you in a discussion in four main areas. I will try to roughly give them equal time. Our first segment, we need to look into the strategic decisions that were made by Al-Nahda. We've had many already said here during this discussion, whether or not Al-Nahda took a revolutionary path or a reform-minded path. Obviously, it was the latter. And whether the coalitions they formed were the correct coalitions, whether there was a cleaning up in the revolutionary moment, and reforming what you call the security sector reform or other kinds of reform, where you still have this revolutionary spirit going on in the country, the accommodations of the former regime, and including obviously the amnesty that was given to certain corrupt elements, and so on and so forth. So from your perspective, and I'm trying to keep it, in less than 15 minutes for each segment, so I appreciate 2-3 minute answers. What do you think the most consequential, most important decisions, strategic decisions that Nahda made, and whether, in your opinion, were the correct ones, or whether there was a clear mishandling or a problem with some of these strategic decisions? As looking back, obviously, in hindsight, people could do, but I think it's important for us as we review this experience to identify such decisions. Let's start with Intisar and go one by one.
Thanks, Dr. Sami. That's a long list of questions. I think that a lot of the evaluations that we are making really, rely also on, counterfactuals. It's really difficult to say if something was the right decision if you don't know what, the alternatives might have been, the alternative scenarios and outcomes. And so we are, it's easy, I think, as academics and researchers to look back, determine whether, or judge whether decisions were correct or not when we, at the time, those elements, information and time and resources that we have now might not have been available to those actors. So something that came out in my PhD research, where I did over 250 interviews with all sorts of actors in the democratic transition, is actually that time is a huge resource constraint that we don't really think of as academics and researchers, because we have a very different temporal register when we're doing research, which is, we look into archives, we do interviews, we have plenty of time. But actually the subjects that we're researching, politicians, act on a very different temporal register, which is crisis driven. And I think that, in order to also, understand whether these were the right decisions, we need to go back and look at the conditions in which they were made. And often they were made on, under significant time pressure, and having to imagine what could be the different scenarios. And so when we look at, for example, whether the coalition in 2015 was the right one for Ennahda, the counterfactual that Ennahda members were considering at the time, what would be the alternative, is not simply exclusion from government, but actually a return to repression. And so it's important to understand, and I think that goes back to what Monica was saying about the trauma, but also it was based on, hard facts, which are, for example, the regional situation. I think the regional situation, what happened in Egypt, what happened in Libya, later on had significant psychological effect on decision making.
Let me stop you here, if I may, going back to the lesson from Egypt. What do you think? What did Nahda take from that lesson? What is the lesson, the main lesson they got from Egypt, and how did it affect their decision?
I think that the two main lessons were, one, that any sacrifice should be made in order to keep the transition on the rails, from going off the rails, including giving up significant preferences that Ennahda might have had in relation to the constitution, in relation to the government. And so because the alternative was very clearly sort of playing out just one country down in Egypt, the alternative to being able to find a negotiated compromise. And so I think that, Ennahda decided that any any concession had to be made. All concessions could be put on the table. And the second thing, I think, was also understanding how little regional and international support there was for the democratic process. I think that we've had a lot of talk about, the international community helping, which they certainly have, I think, with, financially, with programs, etc. But I think when push came to shove, what happened in Egypt really exposed to many democracy supporters around the Arab world and those outside as well, that really, if we needed to sacrifice another democracy in the Arab world or democratic transition, because there were other priorities going on in Europe or the US, then, that had to be done. Or because, the economic relations with Egypt were more important, or military, interests. So I think it also showed, it put more pressure on the political actors, I think, in Tunisia, because it showed that ultimately you cannot rely on much support externally. And so it really had to come down to what kind of accommodation you were willing to make with your political opponents within the country.
Okay, let me take it next to Tahir. And Tahir, what would be, in your opinion, the most consequential decisions that Nahda made that in hindsight, you could say that this was either a correct decision or an incorrect decision?
Yeah, I mean, Intisar actually answered more eloquently than what I wanted to do, but I can still add a couple of things. When you first asked the question, I was thinking of the coalition with Nida after 2014-15. But at the same time, as we discussed in the first round, and Intisar mentioned here now, we have to understand the decisions in the context. Looking back from 2022, we can say, "Oh, that was wrong." But at that moment, it had some, it made sense. To me, when I read the news about that coalition, I was a bit iffy about it. But at the same time, I said, well, I mean, there were reasons for it. So, and they made it because that looked like the right decision, both for Ennahda and for Tunisia.
Let me ask you about the first decision, which was to form a government, even though they came number one at 37%, 89 seats. Do you think it was a correct decision to take the reign of power, or could they have handed over to, let's say, bureaucracy, and then try to wait and see if they were ready instead of getting the blame? I mean, these kind of decisions I'm looking and I'm trying to get answers to. What would historians say, whether it was the correct decision or not correct decision, for Ali Arid, for instance, to become in charge of the Interior Ministry? I'm not trying to say either way, but how would scholars?
You mean 2011?
Yes, very early.
Okay.
I mean, they went into power, into governing without having any preparation. So if you're going to go there, either you clean up and really start from the ground up, but to take over the states through a reform process where you know that they are much powerful, then you're going to get the blame and none of the credit.
Yeah, no. For 2011, I think they made the right decisions. I mean, yes, there are we can find out oh, this was a mistake, that was a mistake, but in general, that was the right decision to take up the responsibility, but at the same time share the responsibility and power with the other major actors in the process. It could be even better if the coalition was broader at that time, but in 2011 dynamics with power politics, etc., that wasn't possible. But at that time, it was probably the right decision. Without that, I mean, in Tunisia in 2011, no one was ready for power. Even today, not many people are ready for power, right? So in 2011, Nahda was not ready for sure, but the other parties were not ready either. Someone had to take up some responsibility, and I think that was the right decision, and that actually moved to Tunisia to its success in democratic transition. So, I mean, I think there's not much, I mean, there are things that we can criticize specifically, but in general, that was not a decision to criticize harshly.
I would like to put the same question forward to Professor Marx, how would you respond to the decisions that were made since the transition?
Yeah, first of all, I would re-emphasize Intisar's very important point about being aware of counterfactuals. Hindsight is 2020, and there are too many tellings of Tunisia's transition already that haven't considered the way that the context unfolded at the time, the critical junctures, the options available. So I will run through and I'll highlight some of them that Ennahda made. I think the positives, most of its concessions, I think Ennahda made very smart strategic concessions. It didn't have many other options. And those concessions helped normalize and integrate it a lot. Obviously, the situation that we find ourselves in today, it didn't completely succeed, but it got very, very, very far. Lustration, refusing the lustration law that came within a hair's breadth of passing. That decision alone kept the Tunisian transition afloat. Tunisia could have gone in the direction of Libya, which pursued a similar lustration law, but it didn't, and that has a lot to do with Ennahda's leadership. Most of the way that Ennahda handled the Bardo crisis of 2013, Ghanouchi's negotiating with SBC was absolutely critical there. Its willingness to voluntarily step down from power, as anti-democratic as that was a huge, remarkable, very positive, I think, strategic decision that kept Tunisia's transition on life support at a very difficult moment. Some bad strategic decisions, in my humble opinion, but these can all be debated, of course. In my own personal writings of the history, I would probably cast these ones in a more negative light. The Economic Reconciliation Law of 2017. I don't think that Ennahda came out well from that. I don't think it helped the party internally. And it was just a bad law. It was a bad law from the get-go. I understand the context of why Ennahda did it. It has to do with this, just constant determination to integrate, to go along, to get along, to normalize itself with the old regime, with the incumbent elites. But I don't think it was a wise move. I think we can also question Ghanouchi wanting to become Speaker of Parliament. This was a decision that focalized a lot of rage against Ennahda. Fairly or unfairly, I think often unfairly, Ghanouchi gets diabolized, really. I know we're kind of overusing this verb, but he does, as a kind of malevolent, malicious Machiavellian puppeteer, who just orchestrates everything from behind in Tunisian politics. It's not fair, but it's the political reality. And I think a savvier politics might have recognized that and not wanted his face to be on so many people's screens, focalizing that anger so much. Again, these things are debatable. I just want to emphasize, lastly, that I don't fault Ennahda at all, actually, for its coalition with Nidat Tunis in 2015 for exactly the reasons that Intisar mentioned. The risks at the time were so enormously high in the perception of Nahdawis, and not wrongly so. When you looked at what was happening regionally, when you looked at the rhetoric of SBC and Nidat Tunis members in their campaign of 2014, it was very exclusionary rhetoric. They were portraying Ennahda as illiterate terrorists, basically. So I don't fault them for going into that coalition. And I think it's important, to really think contextually and, to understand that we tend not to expect victims to be the lead reformists in many situations. We don't expect young Black men to be spearheading police reform in the United States, for example. And a lot of those comparisons apply when we think about the matrix of opportunities for Ennahda. One very quick last point, I don't think Nidat Tunis gets talked about enough. Its dissolution, its total implosion as a party within months after it came to power has everything to do with why we're in this mess today in Tunisia. Tunisians didn't find political parties that could represent them and actually play ball with each other, could actually play the game with each other. And Ennahda was the only party that basically had its act together and any size. Nidat Tunis could have changed that had it not empowered, SBC's son, the princeling, to basically erode the party from within. But that has everything to do with why we're here today. It's obviously multifactorial, but it gets ignored.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marx. the next question, the same question for Dr. Lawrence, if you could run down your list of decisions or policies that you thought were good decisions and which ones maybe were bad decisions.
So the opening of this will be easy. I strongly agree with Intisar's point on counterfactuals and her point on timing and context. I strongly agree with with Monica putting economic reconciliation at the top of the list, something she taught me about, and I said in my remarks earlier. I would just add to the economic reconciliation part that the other biggest problems were not action, but non-action. So they spent way too much time talking about the investment law when the main economic actions, right, had to be on the microeconomic indicators and the business, what the World Bank calls the business climate, which is as bad as ever and has a lot of corruption. So you needed to fix the Tunisian economy before you fixed investment. And that's what I worked at control risks in 2015, 2016 with all the foreign investors who go into Tunisia. They all work with control risks, and their main concerns were not this investment law. It was how hard it is to do business in Tunisia, which was never fixed. And then lack of action, as I said, on security sector reform. There needed to be a negotiation with the police unions, as Monica suggested, and they needed to stop talking about security sector reform because the police unions were allergic to that term, and start talking about security sector enhancements, right? Security sector training, security sector, which is the same thing. It's security sector reform, but they needed to make that palatable. That's messaging. I think that was Intisar or Tahir's point. The messaging around security sector reform, and then do it. And that was, again, the failure of the Larayev moment and the aftermath that Monica was referring to. And on judicial, there's a list of things that were not done. So it was mostly what was not done on economics, what was not done on security, what was not done in judiciary. And let me add one other thing. Even though I agree sort of in a political science way with Intisar's previous point on fragmentation, I also think you can govern in fragmented or unfragmented situations. There's a big debate in Washington around 2019, whether or not Tunisia needed more fragmentation because it's more democratic, or less fragmentation because it's more politically potent, in the way that Tahir was referring to and my other co-panelists. But I don't think that really matters, like fragmentation in and of itself. I think what you need to do is work with whatever coalition, and it's always going to be a coalition under the Tunisian constitution, you have to do reform in the way that my other panelists were talking about. And let me just say one thing, since we haven't brought it up, and it may come up in the following questions. Algeria looms large in this. Algeria produces the slogans, the rap lyrics, the angst, the graffiti, like.
Dr. Lawrence, can you hear us?
I think he froze.
Okay, all right, we'll wait. Hopefully he'll join us. In the meantime, I just want to
I'll text him to see what's up.
Okay, all right. I wanted to ask about foreign policy here, decision, not just domestic. If anybody is thinking of any foreign policy, whether good or bad, particularly relationship with Turkey and perhaps other countries as well, if you have any thoughts on that before we move into the next segment. Anybody? Perhaps not much on that score. Okay.
Everyone here are interested about domestic politics, I guess.
Everybody is domestic politics.
Although Intisar mentioned about the international dimension, which is,
I don't think that could be ignored, because I think this when it comes to Tunisia, there is a success story that could be told, and yet the international support was extremely weak. And why is that? Is it because, as someone has mentioned this morning, that regardless of whatever the so-called Islamists would say, they would always be rejected? And Dr. Lawrence talked about the accommodationist camp versus.
I'm back if you can hear me.
Oh, good. Please go ahead.
My computer's at 89%. It was not power. It just, the Zoom shut down. I had to reboot my computer. So I was almost done. So Algeria looms in that it helps create the modalities of protest that are in Tunisia. Number two, that the lessons of the Algerian experience so much overlap with the Tunisian ones that it's always part of the conversation. And you remember that famous video when Ghannouchi was talking to the Salafists, which is often held up as evidence that he was colluding with the Salafists, when in fact it was the exact opposite. Ghannouchi was trying to teach the Salafists the lessons of Algeria, meaning they should act a certain way. I think he referred to Algeria 13 times in that famous video that is always referred to as proof he was colluding with Salafists in the 2012-13 period. And the last thing is Algeria still mediates. Now, Ghannouchi played a huge role in the reconciliation of Algeria in the late 90s, to the point that to this day, Algerian officials almost bend at the knee when they're dealing with Ghannouchi, because it helped bring the war to end, and genuflect around Ghannouchi in really interesting ways. But Algeria still continues to play the role. So every time a deal is about to be made in Tunisia, people run off to Algiers, or some senior Algerian minister shows up. And so we have to include Algeria even in the strategic decisions, because Algeria was often part of the conversation. So that was my point on Algeria.
Thank you very much. The next set of questions that we wanted to approach was lessons learned. So one of the things that I'll start it out with is it seems like there was a kind of measure of Ennahda's success based upon its ability to cooperate with with other actors, which seems to stand in distinction to the question of hard power. So there was a lot of coverage about judging the Jasmine Revolution based upon, whether or not they were cooperating. And then, as you raised the point, but that wasn't even the main. Those weren't quote unquote primary issues. So, how can Ennahda or any other actors confront this kind of tension when talking about democratic reform? This is just one question of mine, but basically, generally, you can speak about what lessons were learned. I'll first ask Professor Intisar, and then after that, Professor Taher.
So I think in terms of cooperation, we need to understand the function of cooperation. I don't think that Ennahda cooperated simply because it was a good thing to do. But I think it was based primarily on a reading of the history of the region, and understanding that polarization and societal divisions are very cleverly exploited by dictators to be able to undermine movements for democracy and change, right? And so this was based on a reading of what happened in Algeria, what happened in Sudan, what happened in previous sort of coalition movements in other countries. And there was also a history of engagement with other countries. For example, in Yemen, there used to be, I think, exchanges with the conference of Arab nationalists and Islamists that was routinely held in Yemen. And this was seen by Ennahda people as being a very positive thing, because the idea was that actually to be able to move towards democratic change, we need to be able to move beyond the way that dictators are dividing the opposition, the political opposition movement. And so I think that cooperation cannot be understood as being post-2011. It's really rooted, as Tahir's work also shows, rooted in pre-2011 lessons that were drawn from the rest of the region. But of course, as you were saying, what does it say about hard power? I think it also tells us that, electoral power can only get you so far. And I think this is something that we don't often talk about enough, is that who governs is not based on who is elected. Who governs, is based on, there are multiple ways of asserting power. Only one of those is electoral, is government, through electoral means. But there is also economic power, there is media, cultural power, and many others. And I think it's important. And I think a lesson that will be drawn is understanding that the ballot box only gives a small picture of who is governing. But the ability of, I think, Ennahda or other political parties in the future to be able to actually govern effectively is how do you bring together those different forms of power and make them, sort of bring them together to implement reforms in the direction that you want to go. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning the fragmentation, because I think that no political party at the moment in Tunisia is able to actually make all these different actors cooperate in a way towards to be able to implement the reforms that it wants to. So there is a real problem. It's either coercion, which we seem to be going back towards, with the current president. Coercion is a way to force people to go in the direction you want them to. But if you're talking, you going according to democratic legitimacy, the power of those who are actually elected seems quite limited in being able to actually push forward reforms. And so I think this is the major conundrum going forward for any for the political opposition in Tunisia is how do we come together around some. I think that there are efforts to do this at the moment, political parties in the country, and I think it's worth saying that they have also come short in this respect. I mean, I think Tahir was mentioning that most countries don't have most parties don't have any experience in governance. And so, there is a transition that needs to happen within political parties as well, to move from being, pro. I was saying to somebody that to Monica actually, I think last time we spoke, that political parties in Tunisia are too comfortable being in opposition, and I think this is. They are comfortable being sort of calling for democracy against dictatorships, but the really hard task is how to govern and how to, translate your ideology into workable policies. And I think this is an area where all political parties in the Arab world have a problem. And I think it's going to take quite a few years and maybe decades for us to get to the point where we have workable solutions for people's problems.
Thank you very much. Professor Tahir?
First about why cooperation, or specifically inter-ideological or cross-ideological cooperation is important, is that whether this is between leftist and rightist or Islamist and secularist, however you call it, there are certain hurdles to be overcome during this process. That's why cooperation is helpful. First, especially in the context of the Arab world, there is an uncertainty about the Islamist strengths, especially before a democratic process. Since there are no free and fair elections, the other actors do not necessarily know about how powerful the Islamists are. There are just perceptions about their potential strength, but it is not anything certain. Second, there are some uncertainties about the Islamists' motives and intentions as well. These are in the minds of the non-Islamist parties, by the way. So this is before transition and after transition as well. A couple of times it was mentioned that there are prejudices about Ennahda is doing this, is doing that, or they are behind this, behind that. So there are these uncertainties about the motives and intentions as well. And because of all those things, the regimes in the Arab world use these uncertainties and this gap to create the image of the Islamist specter, or the specter of Ennahda, the boogeyman. This is why it is important to overcome and reach across the table and in a way to introduce yourself and find common ground with the others. This is why cooperation is important. It's functional both before and after transition, and Ennahda did that pretty well. But especially about the lessons after the transition, one thing we can mention is the institutionalization in Tunisia. And this is an issue for all Tunisian political actors, not for Ennahda. It is a difficult process after decades of authoritarianism, after decades of individualism, Zionism, to build institutions and routinize institutions. And without that institutionalization, the democracies are vulnerable. There is a reason why democracies are most likely to fall down in the next 10 years or 15 years after transition. So institutionalization could not take place in Tunisia because of all the power dynamics and hard power issues as well. Because there is a huge bureaucracy, both in security sector, both in domestic affairs, both in economy, that the new actors of Tunisian politics do not necessarily have control on. So Monica's example on the Ministry of Interior actually reflects this very well. And we saw that in other institutions as well. In such a situation, it's very difficult to institutionalize. And maybe as a result, a lesson learned is that it is also important to reach out to reaching out the public to explain yourself and explain the situation. So people, when obviously they got the freedom of expression, freedom of association, and no repression in comparison to pre-revolution process, they couldn't necessarily find most of the things they sought from the revolution, especially in the next couple of years. And in economy, in local politics, etc. When this is the situation, people also start feeling a bit discontent about the new system, about democracy as well. It doesn't mean that Tunisians do not necessarily believe in democracy, but they don't necessarily stick with democracy as they were in 2011 or 12. So this kind of created an opportunity for a populist like Kais Saied to exert himself and maybe take power, and even with that, get some support for his actions, especially in the first couple of months as well.
Thank you very much, Tahir. We have, I need to engage both Monica and Dr. Lawrence about the international situation. And then we have the last segment, future scenarios. We need to do all that 20 minutes. So I appreciate brief answers. Dr. Lawrence, you've been an observer. You were at the State Department. You've seen these things unfold. What do you think the most consequential lessons learned when it comes to the international aspects of this, both not just for the Nahda and the Tunisian parties themselves, but also for the outside actors? We've seen how regional players trying to manipulate what's going on, trying to influence it, trying to tilt it, move it in a particular direction. So what do you think the most lessons or the best lessons learned at the international level? And the same question goes to Monica after you.
I'm having trouble with the way this question is framed, only because there's lessons that have been learned and lessons to be learned, and the lessons to be learned haven't been learned. So they're not lessons learned yet. So that's what we're working on, right? We're working on that today. Those lessons have not been learned. I don't think they're going to be learned fast enough. I think and getting back to the points I've been making, the number one issue is that countries after revolution and countries in the Arab world, which always are led by Islamists when you have free and fair elections. My professor in Egypt, Hossein Amin, used to say, if you have free and fair elections in the Arab world, the Islamists win in every country except Morocco. Except he was wrong on Morocco too. So you know, we know they're going to win, right? At least in the 1980s through the 2000s, 2010s, it's another story. Sorry, 2020s, it's another story because of this collective experience. But so they win, but we know that they don't do economics well. And we know that the international community doesn't do economics well in middle-income countries. Tunisia couldn't be a Millennium Compact Challenge country because it was too rich in GDP per capita. The US doesn't do well helping reform middle-income countries and rich countries when it comes to democracy. We do much better with the poorer countries. That's why there have been many more democratic transitions in Africa and poor countries with international support than in middle and upper middle-income countries, because we don't know how to deal with upper middle-income countries when it comes to democratic transitions as well. We don't have the same tools because the tools were built in the 60s and 70s around poverty and other, those types of things, Millennium Challenge goals. So we need to learn how to get economic reform much, much better, and political reform in the context of economic reform. Let me also say that Ennahda drew the right lessons, as did the international community, about the Egypt experience versus the Tunisia experience, in that the majoritarian approach is far inferior to the consensual approach when it comes to political transitions. But I'm thinking about the political transitology literature, and for me, the triptych is always Huntington, right? Because Huntington wrote this book in 1988 about how everybody, including Tunisia, was going democratic, the third wave, right? And then when Algeria crashed, and he had more references to Algeria than any other, in Clash of Civilizations in 94, he basically said, well, the Muslims have a block on democratization because of cultural issues, which he was completely wrong about, and civilizational issues, which he was completely wrong about. But the real good Huntington is 1968 political decay, when he gets at what Tahar was talking about, which is the tipping points. And the transitology literature from Latin Americans too. Things that have to happen after revolutions that didn't properly happen in Tunisia, that didn't properly happen in Egypt, that didn't properly happen in all these failed transitions in Algeria, 88 to 92, the Arab world's first democracy, that we need to get right. So we need to reanalyze in a Huntington 68 sort of way, what are the institutional things that have to happen to allow countries having a revolutionary reformist moment, right? After getting rid of a dictator to make things work. Let me also just say this, getting back to the previous question, which is that Ennahda handled the 2012-2013 political conversation about the Constitution very, very well, for the reasons Monica suggested and the reasons Redwan Masmoudi would have talked about. In that Ennahda, fragmentation or not, was the convener, right, of a really healthy conversation about a consensual approach to a constitution with 90% buy-in, as opposed to 51% buy-in in the Egyptian case. But they never convened on economics. And I'll just finish with 3 points. Tunisia has a terrible taxation system, which is core to making this work. They needed to tax the informal sector in the ways I was suggesting earlier. The taxation system had to be reformed, never was. Tunisian economics won't work without a taxation system that works. They needed to have revolutionary projects in disfavored areas, never happened. They had enough money for it. Go build a hospital in Sidi Bouzid and the highway. So the big demonstration products of what you got from the revolution economically never happened. And then finally, and the international community should have played a role in that. I told the Germans, I told the Americans, I told the French, never happened. And then finally, national service, right? Who were the big three protagonists in the revolution? It wasn't Ennahda, despite their pro-democratic credentials. It was UGTT, it was the Bar Association, and it was the unemployed university graduates. The unemployed university graduates, right, wanted stuff to do after the revolution. Ennahda gave them nothing. You should have had national service, Jasmine service, revolutionary service, where you go out to all these disfavored communities and do what you're trained to do: public health, literacy, electrification, water projects. You needed and they started to talk about it in 2017, 18, 19, but it was too late. You needed to get all these unemployed university graduates moving, making the country better, demonstrating to the population that you're serious about not just national level reform, as Intisar talked about, or regional level reform, which I agree with her, although I see it as a second order issue, but your dividends, payoffs, for the revolution. This is what your community is getting. They never did.
Very well. Monica, before you answer, I want to preface the question with this observation. You've lived in this region long enough to know that the lessons learned by what most people think that the true lessons when it comes to international powers is that they really don't care about democratization in this part of the world, is that they're willing to look the other way when it comes to repressive regimes. They looked at one experiment after another, all the way from the 90s with Algeria, or with the Hamas in 2006, or with the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. So I think that the lessons learned here is that we should not really pay any attention to international powers. Do you think that's a correct conclusion, correct lesson learned, or should we tell them something different?
You should have given me that question. Go ahead, Monica.
All right, you will have another crack at it.
I think it's true. Maybe it's a better question for Bill. Do you want to take a swing at it first?
No. Go ahead. I want to hear you.
All right.
I'm taking my jacket off, though.
If the question is a little bit unclear to me, the one part that did come through loud and clear was the idea that a lot of people might take away the same old, tired, broken down, non-evidence-based lesson. You can already tell what I think about it, that the Arab world somehow is opposed to democracy, or democracy can never flourish in this, horrible, recalcitrant dictatorial soil.
Huntington
was
94.
That the question? Yeah, if Huntington 94 was the question, yeah, I mean, that's a very easy question. I mean, it's obviously categorically not the right answer. As popular as a populist with no solutions like Kais Saied has been at various points over the past year, democracy is far more popular in Tunisia, and the polling consistently shows this. Many more Tunisians want democracy and have wanted democracy consistently, than have consistently wanted Kais Saied. In fact, tragically, a lot of Tunisians turned out on the side might be able to deliver democracy better than the governments over the past 10 years. And by democracy, I mean revolutionary demands that got sidelined, revolutionary dreams deferred, which means representative democratic governance for a lot of people in Tunisia. And they were just so desperate that they were ready to kind of burn the whole house down without much of an understanding of the institutional implications of that and what Saied was really able to bring to the table. But it's not that Tunisians don't want or deserve accountable representative government somehow. I think that would be a very sad and wrong-headed conclusion to take. If it's okay, I will say a couple words about international lessons learned or not learned from my standpoint as a scholar and academic of specializing on Islamist movements. I think one lesson we should take away when it comes to cooperation and democratic transitions and so-called Islamists is to be a little bit leery of how we use the words Islamist and secularist. This is an old pet peeve of mine that I'm sure Intisar, Tahir, and Bill have probably all heard me soapbox about before. But in places like Tunisia and to a lesser extent Turkey, the Islamists are often not Islamists and the secularists are often not secularist, according to Western definitions of those words. So if we're looking at one of the main challenges on which a democratic transition will succeed or fail, as whether or not these two seemingly opposed ideological camps can get along, we need to really be clear about the terms that we're working with, or else we're going to mess up the entire analysis from jump. And I saw so many international actors, from scholars to journalists to diplomats, come in and do that in Tunisia. I was obsessively asked, I would say for about 3 or 4 years after 2011, one question over and over and over and over again. Every time I showed up to talk about Tunisia or tried to pitch something to an editor, it was the old Islamist secularist question. What do the Islamists really want? This sort of question. Questions that danced around that main problem. So we have to be careful with our terminology. And secondly, and I'll conclude here, the inclusion moderation framework that I talked about earlier is biased in favor of actors that promote the status quo. And there's a pretty substantial literature on this. I think about Gillian Schwedler's article, which was a response to her own article. I think it was in Global Politics, World Politics. I'm forgetting the journal, but there's an incumbency bias, in other words. The actors that we think of as being good moderators, good, obedient, well-behaved, safe moderators, especially if we're afraid of them ideologically, if we use a word like
Mr. Marks, we're running up against time. So
I'll just it's my last sentence, are often the actors that are more inclined to work with incumbent elites. So the standards by which we were judging Ennahda as good, obedient Democrats were always a bit unfair and anti-reformist from the beginning.
My apologies about that anti-Zionism. But Professor Lawrence, I'm going to give you one last shot at that the same question before we move into a quick reflection on future scenarios by everybody.
So I think the best answer is the West doesn't have the answers. That the debates about democracy within the Muslim world are complex, just as the debates about democracy in the Muslim world, outside the Muslim world, are complex and distorted and polarized and all the reasons that I'm talking about. And so the only solution, whether you're a democratic partisan within the Muslim world or a democratic partisan outside of the Muslim world, is demonstration effects. You have to constantly prove, right, that you're a Democrat. And if I can add this again, Democrat in terms of economic governance, right? And so you don't sign on to the economic reconciliation law. You do mobilize your population in all the economic ways I listed a minute ago. One of the first articles that came out after Said's coup was the article by Stephen Cook in Foreign Policy, in which he said maybe the Tunisians didn't want democracy. And there was a huge backlash by pro-Kais Saied people along the lines of what Monica was talking about. No, that the pro-Kais Saied supporters and Kais Saied were taking radically anti-democratic positions, and everyone was duped by it, including a lot of people in the West. So we've been educating up, right, within the United States, within Europe, outside of Tunisia, that this isn't democracy. And further confusing things is he has a radical direct democracy theory that was rejected in 2012 explicitly by the constitutional negotiations, that is very Gaddafi-esque, and every time it's been tried in history, turned into a thugocracy. But because it has the word democracy in it, everybody got fooled. So the lesson here is we have to speak with clarity about what democracy is for Islamists, ex-Islamists, and non-Islamists, and what that means in terms of accountable representative government, transparent government, accountable to the international community as well in terms of IMF loans and all that. And we have to do things that demonstrate that we're serious. And we didn't in Tunisia. We didn't have enough of those. And that made it hard for the international community to care or not care, right? Because you can't care more than the Tunisians. We were really frustrated in August and September as we were slammed by Tunisians for standing up for democracy, still to this day, right? And slammed by Tunisians on economic stuff because, and let me just say this because I meant to say it earlier, the joke about Tunisian economics is every Tunisian is a free market socialist, right? And when I was talking about Nehda being a convener, what I forgot to slip in there was that Nehda needed to not only convene a national conversation on the constitution, which they did and succeeded, but they needed to convene a national conversation on economics and sort through what a mixed economy is. It isn't just UGTT's version, right? It isn't just the Saheli elites version. It's both. Mixed economies need business elites with a robust private sector. They need an informal sector becoming a private sector, and it needs labor protections and good wages and all that, right? And it needs the social state, right? And Tunisians have not figured out the economics of it. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. I have to cut you off just because we're running over time. So sure. Thank you for your comments. Last set of questions, just a round robin on future reflections, so we can conclude the session.
What do you think the possible scenarios are? You can run them in 2 minutes each, from best to worst. Let's start with Intisar.
Well, I think that what Kais Saied's future will depend very much on the economic situation. I think that that's what people are waiting to see. There are obviously a mobilized minority of political activists who are, mobilizing around political rights and civil liberties. But I think the vast majority of people will be concerned more about the economic situation. So I think that it will come down to that. The best case scenario is that there will be a return to some form of democracy, and that the opposition can get together and actually propose an alternative. I think, as Monica, pointed out in her recent piece for Dawn that Bill mentioned, the opposition is still sort of fragmented. But I think that there are initiatives to bring them together. And I think that what is needed is very much, as we had with October 18 movement, was a political dialogue What is needed is an October 18 movement for economic dialogue, and really to come together and say, we as the opposition, this is a strong message that we believe in democracy, but democracy that puts people's, social and economic rights also as the priority. And so I think that that's the best case scenario for what could happen. And I think that would really need to address, as we were talking about, public administration reform, because the whole system that is stifling the economy is to do with these, these authorizations, these monopolies, these privileges that companies and certain powerful families and individuals receive, but also judicial reform. I think that after the attacks by, the president on the judiciary, there is going to need to be a conversation, a dialogue around judicial reform. The judiciary does need reform, but not that he is proposing. And so there will, and I think that this was done in previous, rounds of discussions and dialogue, like the Qartash Pact, but it was too sort of restricted within the political elites, and there wasn't enough of a conversation with the public to try to show how political elites are actually trying to resolve these situations, and how there are a lot of difficult trade-offs when we are talking about these reforms. It's not as straightforward as, corruption means just shake some businessmen upside down and we're going to solve all the problems of the country. And so I think that there needs to be an economic dialogue between the opposition parties, but of course that requires them putting aside their ideological opposition and their egos also. And so I think that this will be difficult, but I think that it is possible. And I think, of course, the worst case scenario is that we continue to sleepwalk into a dictatorship. But I think the signs are that there is a lot of opposition growing, and I think that already we see the drop in popularity in the last 6 months. And I think the situation is unlikely to improve for Kais Saied. So I think that. Hopefully, if the opposition can produce an alternative, then people will see that actually, there is a way to fix democracy without destroying it.
Professor Clavos.
On the best case scenario side, there's not much to add. I agree with that entirely. If there's a united front from the Tunisian opposition against Kais Saied, and if the opportunity comes, we can see a return to democracy with a bit better understanding of political and economic situation. But on the other hand, I must admit that right now the ball is on Kais Saied's side. Obviously he has the upper hand, and his decisions and his actions will be important to determine if the opposition will have that opportunity or not. So far, Kais Saied did not deliver most of his promises. He has been quite far from delivering these promises, and his popularity is declining. But at the same time, there is still a lot between this point and to the point that things boil and people take the street in massive numbers. Tunisian people are resilient, which is a great thing, but at the same time, they're resilient with the hardships that they are going through under Kais Saied as well. So if Kais Saied makes mistakes and if things start boiling up, then there can be an opportunity for the opposition, and actually opposition has a responsibility to push Kais Saied further to make him make mistakes as well. But on the other hand, Kais Saied is doing things slowly, taking his time, biding time, and despite his mistakes, he's actually to some extent consolidating his authority with all the actions he has been doing in the last couple of weeks. So I would like to see the best case scenario, but I'm also like losing hope. Like one day I'm more hopeful, one day I'm less hopeful about the future in Tunisia, but I hope we can see the best case scenario turn up as well at the end. Yeah.
Professor Marks?
Yeah, so best case scenario would look a lot like what Intisar had described. It's what I call exit ramp number one in that Dawn piece I published recently. It's the path by which Tunisia gets back to some form of constitutionality the fastest. So in this scenario, Said would magically start to dialogue with people and recognize that he needs to get out of the way. The opposition would probably help him catalyze that epiphany. They would come up with a unified front behind a proposal like what Citizens Against the Coup, this newly formed civil society group, is proposing, to bring back Tunisia's frozen parliament for a short period of time, long enough to pass a few critical pieces of legislation like a new elections law, and before any kind of unconstitutional referendum happens, like the one Sayed wants to plan. So this detours us off Sayed's highly unconstitutional roadmap, which I think is more like a freeway to consolidate a dictatorship. And then once we're detoured, we have an economic October 18th movement. I love how articulately Intisar phrased that. That's such an important hope, and it's been such a challenge. So that's my best case scenario. Obviously, it's a little bit dreamy around the edges, at least. My worst case scenario is a massive humanitarian crisis in Tunisia, and potentially one that gets bloody. Kais Saied is not your garden variety dictator. He is a very ideologically obscure, committed person who has a messianic understanding of himself and who has so far refused to dialogue with absolutely anyone. He refers to his opponents consistently as demons, traitors, microbes, viruses. All of this bodes very poorly, especially in the context of Tunisia's dictatorial, torture-heavy, highly repressive history, and the fact that he just obliterated all due process and judicial independence this week. My most likely scenario is that Tunisia continues to sleepwalk towards consolidated dictatorship. The opposition continues to kind of flail along and not present a united front or an alternative. And it ends up being some combination of mass popular unrest and behind the scenes maneuvering that gets rid of Sayed. And there's going to be a lot of pain, I think, economically and in terms of people's political rights or the lack thereof before we hit that point, unfortunately.
So I'm going to go from worst to best so we can end on a positive note. I think there's about a 10% chance we end up with the worst case scenario, which is, I'll call it the Mali scenario of a coup within a coup. So Said gets forced out by worse people. And then they bring in a sort of Sisi style leadership or worse. And there are many scenarios. You could have civil war. Many things could happen. I'd say that some sort of Mali scenario is about 10% chance. I think there's about a 40% chance that we end up with what you might call the Sisi or Bouteflika scenario, where you have a consolidation of autocracy over time. Everyone will be confident that Tunisian Democrats will be able to force out, which is what the Algerians and Egyptians are telling the Tunisians now. Don't be confident that democracy in the street will be able to force them out. The autocratic consolidation will continue. Said will either have a successor or just find a way to continue himself in that autocratic presidential role. And that goes on for 10, 20 years until he's no longer in the picture. The next two I split. I call it the Arab Spring scenario. And there's a version, Monica just gave one. So one is, I'd say 20%, 20%. One is you have a massive economic explosion that forces him out, and a bit of chaotic, right? Or a friendlier Arab Spring version that's more Pacific, just a mass turnout, and we get, with minimal violence, a transition of power back towards some kind of So that's about 20% chance, some sort of return to constitutionality, although I'm afraid that such a good democracy won't be in the short term under that scenario, as good a democracy as we had. And then 10% chance is the most optimistic, which is Said concedes. He retreats back to the Carthage palace. He says, I'm in charge of defense and foreign affairs. Parliament reopens. This could happen. It could be brokered by the Germans and the Americans. There could be a way in which Said is told by Sahli elites and UGTT and whoever, go back to Carthage Palace, sit down, ride out your 3 years, and we're going to go back to what things were. It's a possible scenario. It's what the Americans think when they're optimistic could happen, but they're not predicting it. They're just hoping for it.
Thank you very much, everybody. I mean, it's funny that our most likely scenario on a positive note is the CC scenario, 40%. That tells you a lot. But let's hope that the last scenario. I want to thank all our 4 panelists, Dr. Intisar Khreigi, Dr. Tahir Kalaviz, Dr. Monica Marks, and Dr. William Lawrence, for this engaging, lively, really fruitful discussion that concluded our 2 days of discussing Al-Nahda Party. We still have 1 more day. Unfortunately, that would be a closed session tomorrow. But I want to invite you again, everyone, next week, starting Saturday, which is the 19th, and Sunday the 20th, and Monday the 21st. And our 4th symposium would be on Iran, on the Islamic Revolution in Iran. That would be about, I think, 17 presentations on these 3 days. So thank you again for joining us for the past couple of days, and I wish you well, and see you tomorrow for those who will join us, and everyone, see you next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.